The prairie was silent, save for the groan of wagon wheels fading into the distance. A lone woman stepped down at the wrong ranch, her shawl tugged by the wind, her eyes carrying more hope than she dared admit. The man on the porch did not welcome her. His gaze was sharp, his words colder still. He had never sent for a bride. And yet, before she could turn away, a little girl pressed into her skirts, whispering with trembling faith, "God finally sent you to us." From that moment, the wrong ranch would never be the same. Night came early on the plains, folding the land in gray long before the lamps were lit. By the time Clara had carried her trunk inside, the air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and the faint creak of the rafters above. Matthew Hale gave no more words than necessary, his silence colder than the wind at the threshold. "You can sleep in the loft," he said at last, nodding toward the narrow staircase that rose against the wall. His voice was rough, worn by disuse. He did not meet her eyes. Clara thanked him softly, though the words felt strange in the room, swallowed by shadows. She carried her trunk upward, each step groaning under her weight, and entered the small loft that looked down over the main room. There was little more than a straw mattress tucked into the corner, and a single blanket folded neatly at its foot. Dust gathered thick along the beams as though time itself had been left to settle undisturbed. She laid her shawl across the bed and sat in the silence. Below, the house murmured faintly, the crackle of firewood, the scrape of a chair, the sound of a child's whisper muffled by distance. Clara wrapped her arms around herself and breathed deep. The house did not feel hostile, only heavy with sorrow, like a place that had forgotten laughter. From the loft she could see details the eye would miss at first glance. By the hearth sat a rocking chair, unmoving, a knitted shawl draped across its arm. Dust dulled the fabric, but the fold showed it had once been handled with care. On the mantel rested a small collection of items: a carved wooden horse, a tin cup, a faded ribbon tied in a bow. Clara felt as though she had intruded into a shrine, into the echo of someone still present though no longer alive. Matthew ate his supper in silence at the table, his movements precise, deliberate, as if the very act of eating was simply another duty to fulfill. Across from him, Eliza sat with her doll propped in the chair beside her. She broke bits of bread and pretended to feed it to the doll before nibbling herself. Clara's heart tightened at the sight. When the meal was done, Matthew rose without a word, his chair scraping against the boards. He stepped outside, lantern in hand, his silhouette swallowed by night. Eliza lingered at the table, her small fingers tracing circles in the crumbs. Clara descended softly from the loft and knelt beside her. "Do you want help with the dishes?" she asked. The girl looked up, eyes wide and uncertain. "Papa says I'm too small." Clara smiled faintly. "Then we'll be small together." They carried the plates to the basin. Clara rolled up her sleeves and let the water run cold over her hands before dipping the dishes in. Eliza watched closely, mimicking her movements, splashing more than washing but glowing with the effort. For a moment, Clara felt less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged at the hearth. Later, as Eliza prepared for bed, she clutched her doll close and lingered near Clara. "Mama used to sing me songs," she whispered. Her voice trembled, like a thread ready to break. Clara brushed a curl of hair from the girl's cheek. "Would you like me to sing one?" Eliza nodded, eyes bright with longing. Clara hummed a hymn from her own childhood, low and steady, the notes carrying softly through the rafters. Eliza's eyes drifted closed, her doll tucked against her, as though the melody had sewn her gently into sleep. When Clara returned to the loft, she found Matthew standing in the doorway below. His lantern rested on the table, his shadow stretched, tall across the wall. He said nothing, only watched as his daughter slept. His face bore no softness, only the weight of a man who had lost too much to risk losing more. Clara turned away, sensing his grief was a boundary she dared not cross. The hours passed in restless silence. Clara lay awake beneath the rough blanket, staring through the small window at a sky crowded with stars. Each one glittered cold, distant, untouchable. She thought of her own past, the letters, the long journey, the hope she had carried like a fragile lantern only to find it sputtering, here. Yet as she recalled Eliza's hand clutching her skirt, her whisper full of desperate faith, Clara wondered if this detour was not mistake but providence. At dawn, the ranch came alive with sounds of work. The creak of the barn door, the lowing of cattle, the dull thud of an axe splitting wood. Clara rose and descended quietly. She found Matthew in the yard, his shoulders bent as he repaired a fence post. The hammer in his hand moved with practiced rhythm, but his eyes were distant as though the task kept him from drowning in thoughts. Clara glanced toward the barn. Tools leaned broken against the wall, handles split, iron rusted. The wagon near. The fence had one wheel missing, left to rot where it had been abandoned. The place bore the scars of neglect, not from laziness, but from sorrow. Work undone, chores ignored, because grief had hollowed out the man who once kept them whole. Eliza appeared at Clara's side, barefoot in the cool grass, holding her doll with one arm and Clara's hand with the other. "Mama's shawl is still in the chair," she said almost proudly. Clara looked toward the house, to the rocking chair by the fire. She must have loved it very much. Eliza nodded. "Papa won't let me move it." Her voice dropped, quiet, as wind through the grass. "He says it has to stay." A silence stretched between them. Clara squeezed the child's hand gently, her throat tight. She understood then. Grief had made the house into a tomb, each object an anchor to a love lost too soon. As the morning sun climbed higher, Clara stood at the edge of the yard and let the wind push against her shawl. She felt herself torn, an intruder among memories not her own, yet bound already to the fragile thread of this household. She had not been meant for this place, yet something deep and wordless told her she was standing exactly where she was needed. And though she dared not say it aloud, the thought flickered within her heart. Perhaps she was meant to arrive here after all. The stagecoach rattled across the prairie like a weary beast, its wheels carving deep grooves into the dust of late autumn. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, gray, heavy, and silent, save for the mournful cry of a crow drifting along the horizon. Wind dragged dry grass into low, restless waves, whispering like voices that had no home. Inside the coach sat Clara Monroe, hands folded tightly in her lap, hidden beneath the edges of a thin, travel-worn shawl. Her fingers trembled, though she tried to still them by pressing them against the fabric. Beside her feet lay a small trunk, scarred from years of use. Folded within it was the dress she had sewn in flickering lamplight back east. The dress she believed would be her wedding gown. She had read the letters so many times they had become a kind of scripture, promising her a place, a man, and a future in the wide country of the West. With each mile she had whispered hope into the dry air, convincing herself she was traveling toward belonging. But as the coach lurched to its final stop, that hope weakened beneath the weight of silence. The driver swung the door wide with a grunt. "End of the line, ma'am." Clara stepped down, her boots sinking into the dust. Before her stretched nothing but the lonely station, a crooked sign, a water trough, a scattering of fence posts leaning against the wind. No man waited for her. No smile, no hand extended to gather her up from her long road. Only emptiness, and the sound of the coach rumbling away, its echo fading like a door shut firmly behind her. Clutching the shawl tighter, Clara lifted her, shrunk, and began the walk toward the distant ranch the station master had pointed her to. Her breath showed faint in the cool air. Each step crunched on the dry earth. In the distance, cattle dotted the hills, their dark shapes unmoving, like stones scattered across the land. The house came into view slowly, weathered boards sagging against years of storms. The barn leaned to one side, patched in places, neglected in others. Smoke trickled from the chimney, thin and reluctant. Clara paused at the gate, heart thudding against her ribs. She smoothed her skirt, tried to straighten her spine, and knocked softly on the door. It opened after a long silence. The man who stood there was not the man she had pictured in her mind while reading those letters. He was broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and carried the kind of silence that weighed more than words. His face was stern, carved in lines of hardship, his eyes shadowed as if they had not known warmth in years. Beside him, half hidden behind the doorframe, a little girl peered out. Barefoot, with tangled hair and a smudge of dust on her cheek, she clutched a worn doll to her chest and stared at Clara as though measuring whether she was real. Clara swallowed and spoke carefully. I am Clara Monroe. I was told this was the Hale Ranch. The man's jaw tightened. His eyes swept over her, over the trunk at her feet, then back to her face. It is, he said at last. His voice was low, edged with suspicion. But I never sent for you. Her breath caught. She tried to steady herself. The letters, she began. They said, no letters from me. His words cut like cold steel. You've got the wrong place. The silence between them deepened, heavy with the weight of misunderstanding. The wind moaned against the walls as if to fill the space neither dared to. Clara's throat tightened. Shame and fear knotted in her chest. She had crossed miles, clung to fragile hope, only to find rejection waiting at the door. Her hand slipped from the shawl, fingers clenching her skirt. She lowered her eyes. Then I've made a mistake. The words tasted bitter. She turned, lifting her trunk once more, though her knees trembled beneath the weight. Wait. The voice was small, almost swallowed by the wind. Clara turned. The little girl had stepped out from behind her father's leg. Her eyes, wide and unguarded, fixed on Clara with something fierce and desperate. She reached forward with a trembling hand, her doll dangling forgotten at her side. Don't go, the child whispered. God finally sent you to us. The words struck Clara like a bell ringing in the emptiness. Her breath shivered. The man, Matthew Hale, she gathered, stiffened, his gaze flicking between his daughter and the stranger at his doorstep. His mouth opened as if to object, then closed again, his silence heavier than before. Clara knelt, setting down her trunk, and met the girl's gaze. The child's hand pressed against her skirt, small fingers curling into the fabric as though to anchor her in place. Clara's heart cracked open at the touch. For the first time in years she felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a wanderer, but as something longed for. Behind them the ranch sagged in disrepair. The field stretched barren, and the man's grief hung like a shadow over the threshold. But in that fragile moment, in the child's whisper, Clara felt an ember stir where only ashes had been. She was not wanted here. That truth was sharp and undeniable, but she was needed. And perhaps, she thought, need was enough. The first sign of the storm came in the uneasy hush that settled over the prairie. All day the wind had shifted, restless and sharp, driving low clouds eastward until they gathered like a dark army above the horizon. By afternoon the sky pressed down heavy and green, and the cattle lowed in anxious tones, bunching close together as though they too sensed what was coming. Clara helped Eliza gather wood from the yard, her shawl tugged tight against her shoulders. Every few moments she lifted her eyes to the horizon. Lightning flickered faint in the distance, jagged spears that lit the sky and left it darker in their wake. By nightfall, rain began to fall in hard, slanted sheets, pelting the roof like stones. The wind rose, rattling the shutters until they shook in their frames. The river beyond the field swelled with each passing hour, its roar audible even above the thunder. Inside, the house groaned with the storm's weight. Clara moved through, the rooms with a lantern, checking windows, her heart quickening with every blast of thunder that rattled the panes. Eliza clung close, her doll pressed against her chest, whispering questions too quiet for Clara to answer. Then came the sound of hooves. Through the window, Clara caught sight of a figure riding through the torrent, a lone horseman bent low against the rain. The lantern light from the porch revealed him only in fragments, a soaked blanket draped across his shoulders, hair dark and plastered to his face, eyes narrowed against the storm. Matthew was already at the door, rifle in hand. When the man dismounted and strode through the mud, Matthew stiffened, recognition darkening his features. The rider entered without waiting to be asked. Water streamed from his clothing, pooling on the floorboards. But his presence was calm, steady as though the storm outside bowed to him. "Tahoma," Matthew muttered, his voice low. The man nodded once. His features were sharp, his expression neither hostile nor yielding. His gaze flicked toward Eliza, and for the first time since stepping inside, a faint warmth stirred in his eyes. "Your mother's friend," Matthew said brusquely to the girl. "Go on now, stay close." Eliza broke into a smile that surprised Clara. She dropped her doll and ran forward, wrapping her small arms around the man's leg without hesitation. Tahoma knelt, resting his hand lightly on her hair, his expression softening in a way that startled Clara with its gentleness. Unspoken trust passed between them, one Clara did not yet understand. The storm raged on, battering the house, demanding that they all remain inside. Matthew lowered the rifle but kept it within reach, his silence a wall between himself and the visitor. Clara fetched a second blanket and offered it without a word. Tahoma accepted with a nod, his eyes meeting hers, briefly dark, unreadable, but not unkind. They gathered near the hearth, the fire snapping beneath the storm's roar. Shadows leapt across the walls, the lamplight catching on every scar of the room, the broken handles, the worn shawl in the rocker, the cracks in the boards. For a long while, no one spoke. The thunder did all the talking. It was Tahoma who broke the silence. His voice was low, resonant, shaped by words older than this land had known in English. "The river will rise before dawn. The cattle will press against the fences. You will need to move them when it eases." Matthew gave a curt nod. "I know it." More silence. Rain hammered the roof. Eliza curled against Clara's side, her small body trembling with each rumble of thunder. Clara stroked her hair absently, watching the men across the fire, their silence full of weight, but different in kind. Matthew's was hardened by grief. Tahoma's was deliberate, dignified, the silence of someone who could say more but chose restraint. At length, Clara asked softly, "You knew her then, Matthew's wife?" Tahoma's eyes lifted to hers. He nodded once. She showed kindness when others would not. She carried peace in her hands. He turned slightly toward Eliza. "And she gave life to this one. That is no small thing." Clara felt Matthew stiffen at the mention, though he said nothing. His gaze stayed on the fire, his face shadowed, but his hands curled tightly around his knees. Tahoma's words settled heavy in the room, mingling with the smell of rain and smoke. He spoke again, not to Clara, but into the air, as if reciting to the fire itself. "The land remembers. Every drop of rain, every footfall. We live upon it as guests. When we take without balance, it turns against us." Clara listened, drawn in by the cadence of his voice, the calm weight of his presence. It was not sermon nor lecture, but a truth carried in the marrow of his bones. She saw Eliza listening too, wide-eyed, as though her mother's memory spoke through him. And for the first time she noticed Matthew's shoulders ease ever so slightly, as if the storm outside had taken some of the weight from him. He said nothing, but he did not interrupt. Hours passed that way, the four of them bound by rain and firelight. Clara felt herself strangely steadied by it, as though an unseen hand guided her through the fear of thunder, the uncertainty of this house, the ache of rejection. She was no closer to belonging, and yet, something about the circle around the hearth, fragile and unlikely as it was, felt like protection. When the thunder finally rolled farther east and the rain thinned to a steady whisper, the house seemed to exhale. Eliza had fallen asleep against Clara, her doll slipping to the floor. Matthew rose and carried her gently to her bed, his hand lingering at her shoulder longer than he meant to. Clara watched him, her heart stirring at the tenderness hidden in a man so bound by silence. Tahoma remained by the fire, eyes reflecting the last of the flames. When Matthew returned, their gazes met, old understanding in the exchange. Clara climbed to the loft at last, weary yet restless. She lay awake listening to the softened rain and the hushed murmur of voices below. The storm had forced them together, pressed strangers and grief into one fragile shelter. And as sleep finally claimed her, she could not shake the feeling that what had happened was more than weather, that perhaps storms were sent not only to break fences but to bind souls beneath one roof. The storm passed with dawn, leaving the prairie washed clean but unsettled. Pools of water glimmered in the ruts of the yard, and the river hissed against its swollen banks. Inside the house, though, the air did not lighten. The silence that followed the storm carried its own weight, thicker, more personal, harder to endure. Clara rose early, gathering her shawl against the chill. The fire had burned low, and she coaxed the coals back to life with careful hands. She moved quietly, not wishing to wake anyone, but before long she heard boots on the floorboards. Matthew appeared in the doorway, his shirt half buttoned, his hair still damp from the basin. His eyes flicked toward her, then toward the hearth, then away again. "You needn't trouble yourself," he muttered. Clara paused, the poker in her hand. The fire was near out. It seemed worth saving. He gave no answer, only reached for his hat and stepped outside, his stride brisk as though escape were urgent. Clara exhaled, the poker trembling faintly in her grip. His distance pressed against her more than anger would have. Anger at least was a kind of attention. Silence was exile. Yet Eliza woke with the sun and came padding down the loft stairs, her hair tangled from sleep. She slipped her hand into Clara's and smiled up at her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Will you braid it for me?" she asked shyly. Clara's chest tightened and she nodded. She sat the girl before her and drew a comb through the dark strands, humming as she worked. The braid fell neat down Eliza's back, bound with a strip of ribbon Clara had saved from her trunk. When Matthew returned from the yard, his eyes caught briefly on the braid. He said nothing, but the flicker of surprise in his expression did not escape Clara's notice. The days that followed unfolded in much the same way. Clara took to mending what she could, shirts left in baskets, socks with worn heels, even a torn curtain hanging limp at the window. Her stitches were small, steady, each one a quiet offering. At the table, she taught Eliza simple songs, their melodies filling the house with a fragile warmth. Sometimes the child laughed outright, the sound bright as glass struck by sunlight. Whenever that happened, Matthew would glance up sharply, as though laughter itself were a danger. Once, when Clara set bread on the table, Matthew cleared his throat. "You don't have to make yourself busy here. It won't be for long." Clara met his eyes for the first time in days. "Perhaps not," she said softly. "But while I am here, I cannot sit idle." Eliza reached for her hand beneath the table, small fingers curling tight. Matthew's gaze lingered hard as stone, yet somewhere beneath it, Clara sensed a crack. Gratitude wrestled with pride in the shadow of his silence. At night, she lay awake, in the loft, listening to the sounds below. Matthew's chair scraping against the floor, the steady rhythm of wood being split outside late into the evening, the slow tread of boots pacing the boards. She wondered if he kept himself busy for the same reason she did, to fight off thoughts that would not let him rest. It was in such a night that she overheard him by the fire, speaking low though he thought no one listened. "She'll leave when the stage comes." His voice was rough, almost broken. Best not to let Eliza hope. Clara turned her face into the pillow, her heart aching. She was both intruder and comforter, wanted by the child but not by the father. The duality tore at her, yet she could not deny that each day rooted her deeper into their lives, whether or not Matthew wished it so. The tension between them grew sharper in the smallest of moments. When Clara reached for the kettle, Matthew was already there and their hands brushed. He drew back as if scalded, though his eyes lingered half a second too long. When she stepped out to gather laundry before a coming rain, he followed a pace, behind, as if ensuring her safety, though he said nothing of it. Restraint hung between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap with the weight of all that went unsaid. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Clara sat sewing by lamplight. Eliza leaned against her shoulder, half asleep. Across the room, Matthew repaired a harness strap, his knife working steadily at the leather. The quiet seemed almost fragile, like glass that could shatter at the smallest sound. Clara glanced up and found him watching. Not openly, but from beneath his brow, his hands stilled on the leather as though he had forgotten the work. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the air between them thickened. Suspicion, gratitude, longing, and fear tangled so tightly, neither could separate them. Then Matthew looked away, the knife biting hard into the leather as though to bury the moment. Clara lowered her gaze to her stitches, her pulse unsteady. She realized then that belonging was not something to be granted overnight. It must be earned patiently, quietly, with endurance. She would have to prove, not through words but through constancy, that she was not another loss waiting to happen. Eliza stirred against her shoulder, murmuring in her sleep. Clara stroked her hair, humming a lullaby beneath her breath. The sound drifted through the room, filling it like the faintest dawn light after a long night. And though Matthew did not look, up again Clara knew he heard. The prairie had its own way of warning when danger drew near. The dogs barked at shadows, cattle grew restless in the night, and even the wind seemed to carry unease. Clara sensed it first in Matthew's posture, how his hand lingered near the rifle propped by the door, how his eyes searched the horizon longer than before. Something pressed at the borders of their lives, invisible but menacing. "They've been prowling again," he said one evening, his tone clipped. "Cattle thieves, bold enough to test fences." Clara glanced toward Eliza, who sat on the floor playing with her doll. "Does she know?" "She knows enough." His jaw tightened. "It's my job to keep them out. My job, not yours." But Clara did not look away. "We all live under this roof now. If trouble comes, it comes for all of us." Matthew said nothing. Yet his silence was no longer the cold dismissal it once had been. It was the silence of a man hearing truth he could not yet admit aloud. That night, the smell of smoke tore Clara from sleep. She sat upright in the loft, heart racing. Below, Matthew was already moving, his boots thudding hard against the floorboards. The barn was aflame. Through the window, orange light bled into the sky, sparks lifting like fireflies into the dark. The cattle bellowed in panic, and above their cries came Eliza's scream. "Daisy!" she cried. "Papa, Daisy's in there." Clara's breath caught. Daisy, the little gray mare that Eliza adored, her only companion since her mother's death. Clara saw the terror in the child's eyes, the way she clutched the doorframe as if ready to run headlong into the fire herself. Before Matthew could stop her, Clara was already across the yard. The heat roared against her face, smoke clawing at her throat. She pulled her shawl across her mouth and forced her way into the blaze. Inside, the barn was a world of fire and shadow. Beams groaned, hay crackled, and the smoke turned the air into a choking wall. Clara stumbled forward, her arms outstretched. "Daisy!" she called, her voice ragged. A frantic whinny answered. Through the smoke she found the mare thrashing against her stall, eyes wild with fear. Clara fumbled at the latch, her hands searing against the hot iron. She bit back a cry, tugged hard, and the gate swung open. The horse bolted, nearly knocking her down. Clara staggered after it, coughing, half-blind. Behind her, the roof split with a crash of sparks. "Clara!" Matthew's voice cut through the roar of flames. He appeared out of the smoke, rifle slung across his back, his eyes burning fiercer than the fire itself. He caught her by the arm, steadying her, dragging her toward the open air. Together they stumbled from the barn just as part of the roof collapsed in a thunder of sparks. Eliza ran to them, tears streaming, and threw her arms around the mare's neck. Daisy whickered, trembling, but safe. Matthew dropped his rifle in the dirt and turned to Clara. For a moment, the world shrank to the sight of her. Her hair singed at the edges, her dress streaked with soot, her hands blistered from the heat. "Are you out of your mind?" he demanded, but his voice cracked. His hands shook as he caught hers, staring at the angry burns across her skin. "You'd have let her lose the last thing she loves," Clara whispered, breathless. I couldn't stand by. Matthew pulled her closer, his forehead nearly against hers, his grip unyielding. You could have died. And you came in after me. The words silenced him. Their breaths mingled, ragged and sharp. In that moment, through fire, smoke, and fear, something broke open between them. No longer intruder and widower, no longer stranger and unwanted guest. They were bound by survival, by the ferocity of love that demanded action no matter the cost. When at last the barn caved into a smoldering heap, the three of them stood together in the ash-glow of ruin. Father, daughter, and the woman who had saved what they held most dear. Later, under the lantern light of the kitchen, Matthew sat Clara at the table and fetched a basin of cool water. His hands, rough and scarred from years of work, moved with an unexpected gentleness as he bathed her burns. The touch made her flinch, but not from pain, from the strange tenderness she had never thought to feel from him. He bound her palms in strips of linen, his head bowed close to hers. His voice, when it came, was low and unguarded. I thought losing Anna was the worst pain a man could bear, he said, each word thick with effort. But tonight, when I saw you in that fire, He broke off, his breath shuddering. I couldn't face losing you too. Clara's throat tightened. She searched his face, the lines etched by grief, the eyes hollowed by years of solitude. And beneath it all, she saw the truth. Not indifference, but fear. Fear of love, fear of loss, fear of daring to hope again. She reached across the table, laying her bandaged hand over his. You haven't lost me, Matthew, not tonight. Not unless you turn me away. He closed his eyes, his jaw trembling as though he were fighting against a flood. His fingers tightened around hers, rough but steady. In the quiet that followed, the air seemed different, like the earth after rain, still heavy with smoke but seeded with new life. Clara realized then that love was no longer an impossible dream, whispered to herself in lonely nights. It had come through fire, forged in the heat of survival and courage. It had arrived not as romance first imagined, but as necessity, as bond, as truth too fierce to deny. And Matthew, for the first time, since she had arrived, did not look away. The fire had left its scars. The barn was little more than a heap of charred beams and blackened ash, and the smell of smoke clung to the air for days. Yet strangely, the ranch no longer felt like a place ruled by grief. Amid the ruin, something new had risen. Quiet, unspoken, but steady. Clara felt it first in Matthew's voice. Where once he had met her with guarded silence or sharp suspicion, now his words carried the weight of respect. He did not thank her directly. Matthew was not a man for easy gratitude, but he no longer looked at her as an intruder. Instead, his gaze followed her with a gravity she could not ignore. When she mended Eliza's dresses, he lingered by the doorway, not to criticize, but simply to watch. When she set bread on the table, his rough hand brushed hers in passing, not intentional, but not withdrawn either. And when he saw her struggle to lift a bucket from the well with her bandaged palms, he took it from her wordlessly, as if it were the most natural thing. Tahoma lingered a few more days, helping mend the cattle fence, his quiet presence steady as stone. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Clara overheard him speaking softly to Eliza in their tongue, the little girl laughing at words she could not yet shape properly. Matthew stood off at a distance, watching them, shoulders taut. When Tahoma rose to leave the next morning, he stopped before Clara. His dark eyes held hers, reading far more than he spoke aloud. You belong here now, he said simply. His gaze flicked toward Matthew, then back to her. He sees it too, though pride blinds him. Clara's breath caught. I've only borrowed space beneath this roof, nothing more. Tahoma's lips curved in the faintest smile. Borrowed things often become woven in, if handled with care. The land teaches us this. He tipped his oar, head in farewell, his horse carrying him into the distance until he was little more than a dark figure against the wide horizon. Clara stood long after he had gone, his words echoing inside her. Yet despite the warmth she felt growing in this place, she knew her time was meant to end. The stage would come in 2 days, bound for the next town. She had no right to linger, no claim to a life already heavy with sorrow. She began to pack her few belongings, folding each piece of clothing with hands that trembled more than she cared to admit. Eliza noticed. The little girl shadowed her every step, clinging tighter than before. Clara brushed back her hair and whispered, "Don't be afraid, child. Your papa is here. He won't let the world take you." But Eliza shook her head fiercely. "Don't leave." Clara swallowed hard, her throat aching. "I'm not meant to stay. Sometimes we only pass through, like travelers on the road." Eliza's small face crumpled. "God finally sent you to us, you said so yourself. If he did, then he don't mean for you to go." Clara felt her heart split. She gathered the girl into her arms, pressing her cheek against Eliza's soft hair. The child's words burned with truth, piercing through every wall Clara had built around herself. The morning of her departure came with a pale dawn, and a sky stretched endless above the plains. Matthew harnessed the wagon without a word, his movements deliberate, his face carved into stone. Eliza sat between them, silent tears streaking her cheeks, her doll clutched tight in her lap. The ride to the station was long and heavy, the rhythm of hooves beating against the silence neither of them dared to break. When the small cluster of buildings came into view, the weathered sign, the dust swirling at the edge of the road, Clara's chest tightened. The stagecoach waited, horses pawing the ground, driver calling out for passengers. Clara stepped down, clutching her satchel. Matthew remained seated, his hands gripping the reins, his eyes fixed ahead. Eliza scrambled from the wagon and ran after Clara, clutching her skirts. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't leave us, not now." Clara knelt, drawing her close. Tears blurred her vision, the child's desperate hands fisting into her dress. For a moment she thought she could summon strength enough to let go, to turn and step onto that stage. She told herself it was the sensible thing, the safer path, the one that kept her heart from further breaking. But then Eliza lifted her tear-streaked face and whispered again, "God finally sent you to us." Clara's resolve shattered. She pressed her forehead to Eliza's, holding her tight. "Then I will not go," she breathed. "Not if God himself has planted me here." She rose, her satchel slipping from her hand. The driver called again, impatient, but she no longer heard him. Clara turned, and there was Matthew, standing at last, his tall frame casting a shadow long across the dirt. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching, stripped of the pride that had once kept him bound. He did not speak of love. He did not make promises in grand words. Instead, he stepped forward and lifted her satchel, then turned back toward the wagon, as if there had never been any doubt she would return with them. Clara felt her breath leave her in a rush, her chest loosening, her soul easing. She followed, Eliza's hand clasped firmly in hers. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, but the silence was changed. It was no longer heavy with suspicion or grief. It was filled instead with something softer, a quiet understanding, a new foundation being laid. When they reached the house, Matthew opened the door wide. He did not offer speeches, but in the hearth's warm glow, an extra chair had been pulled close to the fire. On the table, a place had been set, as if waiting for her all along. Clara stepped inside, her heart trembling with the fragile beauty of it. She was not a guest now, not a mistake. She was part of this home, woven into its very fabric, as Tahoma had said. That night, when Eliza curled against her side with the doll clutched in her small arms, Clara looked across the fire at Matthew. He met her gaze steadily, a faint nod his only acknowledgement. Yet in that nod lay everything: protection, partnership, and the promise of second chances. The flames danced, shadows shifting along the walls, but the room no longer felt haunted. For the first time it felt whole. And outside, beneath the vast western sky, Three souls once broken sat bound together by endurance, by grace, and by love. Love, forged not in easy words but in the hard silence of survival.